On August 31st, 2003, the Sepik family home in Carlsbad, New Mexico, was filled with the promise of a beautiful Labor Day weekend. Friends and family were gathering for a cookout and enjoying the final days of summer. But at 2:15 that afternoon, the phone rang, and their world was shattered by just 6 words from their daughter's roommate. "Have you talked to Katie today?" Those words marked the beginning of an unimaginable catastrophe for Dave and Jayanne Sepik, a nightmare that would end in the discovery that their daughter had been taken from them. It was a brutal, senseless act of violence that stole a vibrant young woman from the world. But from the depths of that personal tragedy rose a national revolution in law enforcement. Katie Sepik's death and her family's refusal to let her be forgotten would expose a deadly flaw in the American justice system and ultimately forge a legacy that has saved countless lives. At 22 years old, Katie was just beginning a new chapter, having recently enrolled in the MBA program at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces. The night of Saturday, August 30th, 2003, began like any other for a graduate student. Katie was out with friends at a party. After getting into an argument with her boyfriend, she stormed out, deciding to walk the 5 or 6 blocks back to her apartment. In her anger, she left without her purse, her keys, or her cell phone. It was the last time anyone who knew her would see her alive. The next morning, a group of target shooters made a horrifying discovery at an old abandoned city dump site on the outskirts of Las Cruces. They found the partially clothed and burned body of a young woman. A few agonizing hours after that first phone call, the Sepik family's worst fears were confirmed. It was Katie, and an autopsy would later reveal the full, horrific scope of the attack. Now, normally, I wouldn't get into the details here, but given what happens in this case and the changes it brought about, I think it's important to know the monster we're dealing with. She had been subjected to the most disgusting form of assault, strangled, and then her body was set on fire. In the midst of their paralyzing grief, detectives gave the Sepik family a single, crucial piece of information that offered a sliver of hope. Katie had fought back against her attacker, desperately and fiercely. Under her fingernails, investigators found traces of his skin and blood, and from this, a complete, viable DNA profile. The profile was immediately uploaded to CODIS, the national database operated by the feds, but unfortunately, nothing came back. The family and the police held on to the same belief. A person this violent would surely be arrested for another crime, his DNA would be taken, and the system would flag him as a match. They waited for the cold hit that would bring them justice. But for 3 long years, there was only silence. The weekly database searches came back empty. Leads dried up, and the investigation went cold, leaving the Sepik family trapped in an agonizing limbo of unanswered questions. This frustrating silence wasn't simply bad luck. It turned out it was the direct result of a fundamental systemic flaw in how the nation's most powerful crime-fighting tool was being used. The CODIS database, which held millions of DNA records, was tragically incomplete. At the time, nearly every state, including New Mexico, only collected DNA samples from offenders after they had been convicted of a felony and were entering the prison system. This created a dangerous and often lengthy gap. A violent criminal could be arrested for multiple serious crimes, but as long as they weren't convicted and incarcerated, their DNA would never be entered into the system. Simply put, someone who committed one of the worst crimes imaginable could get bail because their DNA wasn't yet logged in the national database. Katie's case would become the prime exhibit of this deadly loophole. The most painful irony of the Katie Sepik case is that the perpetrator was in police custody just months after her slaying. In November 2003, a man named Gabriel Avila was arrested for aggravated burglary in New Mexico. The man whose DNA was under Katie's fingernails was clapped in cuffs, yet he remained completely invisible to her investigators. Because the law only required DNA collection upon conviction, no sample was taken from the perp at the time of his arrest. He was eventually released on bond and remained free for another 18 months before finally being convicted and sent to prison for that burglary in November 2004. This fact would later haunt Katie's parents and fuel their crusade for wider justice. And there's a particularly haunting quote from Katie's mother that, honestly, I wish I could read verbatim, but this platform wouldn't allow it, and I don't want to diminish its impact. Basically, though, her mom asked lawmakers how many other young women he committed horrific assaults against in the 18 months he was out. Finally, in December 2006, more than 3 years after Katie was slain, the system worked as it was designed to, but only after an agonizing delay. As a convicted felon now serving time in the New Mexico corrections system, Gabriel Avila was required to submit a DNA sample. His profile was processed and uploaded to CODIS. Almost immediately, the system lit up and matched the genetic information found under Katie's fingernails. Armed with the irrefutable match, detectives confronted Avila in prison. The genetic evidence was just the beginning. They had also found other incriminating items, including a diamond ring Katie had been wearing inside his truck and tire tracks near her body that were a match to his vehicle. Faced with this mountain of evidence, Avila confessed to everything. The prosecutor on the case was the district attorney for Donna Ana County, a woman named Susana Martinez. With the DP still a legal option in New Mexico, she used it as a powerful bargaining chip. To avoid a trial and the potential to receive that big state-sponsored DP, Gabriel Avila pleaded guilty to absolutely everything. Combined with his previous 9-year sentence for burglary, he was sentenced to serve almost 80 years in prison at minimum. Notably, this district attorney would later become the governor of New Mexico and would also play a major role in turning this tragedy into something that would save so many lives. With the perpetrator behind bars for life, Dave and Jan Sepik turned their full attention from seeking justice to preventing injustice. They dove into researching the law and fully grasped the conviction versus arrest loophole that had allowed their daughter's predator to remain free. They realized that if law enforcement collected DNA upon felony arrest, treating it just like a modern fingerprint, it could change everything. It could solve cold cases sooner, exonerate innocent people who were wrongly accused, and take violent repeat offenders off the streets before they could claim more victims. The family became tireless advocates, sharing their story in the halls of the New Mexico State Legislature, and by the end of 2006, their efforts paid off. The state passed the first Katie's Law, which mandated DNA collection for arrests involving a specific subset of violent felonies. The law's impact was both immediate and stunning, and less than 2 hours later, a man was arrested for a robbery and found to have committed a double slaying. In 2011, with the help of that former prosecutor turned governor, Susana Martinez, this law was expanded out to include this requirement for all felony arrests. But the Sepiks weren't done yet, and they took their fight to the nation's capital and to state houses across America. Their powerful story, backed by the clear data of success from New Mexico, created a groundswell of support. In 2012, Congress passed the federal Katie Sepik Enhanced DNA Collection Act, which provided grant funding to incentivize other states to adopt similar laws. The movement had significant critics, and the constitutional debate eventually reached the nation's highest court. In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the law was constitutional for a serious offense and was a normal police booking procedure, much like a fingerprint or a photograph. As of now, these laws have been passed in 25 states, with new states joining the movement routinely and catching numerous offenders this way. Sadly, of course, none of this brings Katie herself back or makes the pain any less real to her family. However, her memory lives on in the innumerable lives that have been saved in her name. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, reminding you to take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications if you're enjoying my content. Also, there's this new feature that allows you to hype up a video to improve its visibility in the algorithm, so don't forget to hit the hype button as well. On April 20th, 1989, a shocking scene unfolded in the quiet woods of rural Virginia. A local turkey hunter stumbled upon the body of 61-year-old Ethel Kidd, bound upright to a tree just a few miles from her home. Police had scoured those woods in the days following Ethel's disappearance, yet here she was now. This was evidence that the perpetrator had likely returned later to dump her body in an area that had already been searched, a brazen move seemingly meant to taunt investigators. Ethel had vanished 8 days prior, and the condition of her remains added another layer of horror. She had been indecently assaulted and strangled, yet her body showed almost no signs of decomposition, indicating she'd been stored somewhere cold in the interim. To the tight-knit community, it was unthinkable that such a heinous crime could happen in their backyard, and with a perpetrator bold enough to flaunt this evil. This gruesome discovery marked the start of a perplexing mystery that would take years to finally solve. And the shock twist that did solve it still has some people, namely myself, questioning what actually happened till this day. Ethel Kidd was a 61-year-old mother of 5 who had recently built a dream retirement home with her husband Gilbert in the rural community of Burr Hill, Virginia. She was a devoted wife, mother, and grandmother who truly loved the simple pleasures of country living. The area was about 70 miles outside of the nation's capital, offering a peaceful retreat not far from their children and grandchildren. Ethel's world revolved around her family, and she looked forward to spending her golden years doting on her grandchildren and enjoying the quiet life near her loved ones. Unfortunately, those plans would be cut short in the most devastating way imaginable. April 12th, 1989 began like any other day for Ethel. She spent the morning visiting her daughter, who lived just up the road, and returned home around 2 o'clock that afternoon. A neighbor later recalled seeing her stopping to check her mailbox at the roadside at around that time. Ethel's husband was out of town on business that day, but nothing seemed amiss that afternoon as she settled back in at home. The next morning, however, Ethel failed to show up for her routine coffee visit with her daughter, and repeated phone calls to her house went unanswered. By 9:30 on the morning of April 13th, Ethel's worried son-in-law arrived at her property to check on her. He found Ethel's car parked in the driveway and the front door left unlocked, which was alarming, since Ethel was known to keep her doors secured. Lying in the grass was a map, oddly out of place, as if dropped or discarded by someone passing through. Inside the house, everything was normal and undisturbed, and there were no signs of a struggle, and no sign of Ethel herself. Concerned family and neighbors alerted authorities, and police quickly organized extensive searches of the surrounding fields and woods. Yet the initial search turned up nothing, and Ethel Kidd had seemingly vanished without a trace. Investigators ended up picking up that oddly out-of-place map, and what they found in it was shocking. They found motel stationery tucked in it, with disturbingly suggestive phrases scribbled on it in completely indistinct, normal-looking handwriting. And keep in mind my specific phrasing here, because it'll be important as we go forward in this case and analyze the shocking twist that cracked it wide open. They suspected the perpetrator had been using these phrases to proposition strangers along the highway, This bizarre collection of notes and plans was immediately recognized as a critical piece of evidence. The list written by the perp laid out steps for the crime in an eerily matter-of-fact way, including preparations for a disguise, obtaining a fake identity, and selecting a location. Further, there was also a cryptic notation saying HCTPSG, short forms thought to mean handcuffs, tape, and surgical gloves by the investigators. Besides the map and its creepy contents, forensic examiners noted a few other clues. The cord used to tie Ethel was a type of heavy drapery cord only found in hotels and hospitals, not the kind of rope available at a local store. Additionally, microscopic fibers on Ethel's clothing were consistent with the upholstery from a 1970s model Chrysler car. All of these clues painted a picture of a calculated predator who had put considerable thought into the crime, but who had likely unknowingly left significant clues behind. However, despite having this intriguing evidence, investigators still didn't know who they were looking for. Unbeknownst to the perp, the evidence he left behind would eventually provide the key to catching him. In the months and years that followed, authorities chased down numerous leads, but struggled to pinpoint the person responsible. Criminal profilers believed that the attacker was likely an opportunistic predator. A profile determined that he was probably a white male in his 30s or 40s who traveled for work, stayed in motels, and prowled rural highways looking for victims. The brazenness of the crime and the suggestive phrases hinted that he might have approached other women before, escaping unnoticed. At one point, a regional task force even examined whether Ethel's abduction and slaying might be connected to a string of similar unsolved cases in Virginia. But ultimately, no solid link or suspect emerged, and the serial offender theory was put aside. By the early 1990s, despite exhaustive efforts, the case of Ethel Kidd had gone cold, leaving her family devastated and the community on edge. In a bid to revive the investigation, authorities even sought help from the media. Ethel's story was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in late 1991, but no useful tips came from that initial broadcast. But as I've mentioned before on this channel, a segment on Unsolved Mysteries often paid dividends over time, and reruns were seen by tens of millions of people over the years. In 1995, 6 years after Ethel's slaying, an unexpected breakthrough finally came in the form of that Unsolved Mysteries dividend. When the segment about the case re-aired on the Lifetime channel in 1995, one anonymous viewer noticed something startling. This anonymous tipster phoned the Unsolved Mysteries hotline to report that the strange handwriting in the perpetrator's list looked eerily familiar. According to this caller, it belonged to a man named Edward Beverly, who had once lived in the Burr Hill area. According to the tipster, this individual had abruptly moved away shortly after Ethel's death. Now I've just got to jump in here and say that I've always been skeptical of the handwriting angle in this case. It feels far too flimsy to hinge a breakthrough on, especially when people often see what they want to see in handwriting samples. A list written by the perpetrator could easily have traits that overlap with dozens of people in a small community. What strikes me more is the possibility that the anonymous tipster wasn't really relying on handwriting at all. Maybe they already suspected Edward Beverly, but used the handwriting as a safe excuse to bring his name forward without outing themselves as someone with inside knowledge. In that sense, the handwriting was more of a smokescreen used as a way to pass along a name without getting too close. I can't help but wonder if the so-called anonymous tipster wasn't some random viewer at all, but maybe a cop or someone nudged along by one. It's entirely possible an officer who already suspected Edward Beverly wanted a way to push his hunch to the forefront of the investigation. Getting a quote-unquote credible tip from the public would give them cover. But that's just complete speculation on my part, and it's always possible that someone anonymous did indeed recognize Beverly's writing. Acting immediately on this tip, investigators dug into Beverly's background and discovered a telling coincidence. At that very moment, Beverly was sitting in a Tennessee prison, serving time for an armed robbery conviction. He was 51 years old and had previously resided in Ethel's community around the time of the attack. Once Beverly was on law enforcement's radar, the evidence against him mounted swiftly. Handwriting experts confirmed that the scrawled to-do list found in the map was indeed written in Beverly's hand. Not long after, DNA testing conclusively matched Beverly to the biological evidence from the indecent assault on Ethel. His fingerprints likewise matched latent prints lifted from some of the crime scene items. In a final damning twist, two of Beverly's own nephews came forward to identify the recovered map as the very one their uncle always kept in his car. Investigators believe that on April 12, 1989, Beverly spotted Ethel working in her yard and seized the opportunity to approach her under false pretenses. He likely pretended to be lost and asked for directions with the map in hand as a prop, taking advantage of Ethel's good nature towards a stranger in need. With the tip and the forensic evidence now connecting all the dots, Virginia authorities charged Beverly before he could be released from his Tennessee prison term. Beverly was extradited back to Virginia to face trial, and nearly a decade after Ethel's life was taken, a jury found him guilty of her slaying and related charges. In 1998, he was sentenced to multiple life terms in prison, 3 life sentences, ensuring that this violent predator would never walk free again. Beverly would ultimately perish behind bars from cancer in 2008 while serving out his life sentences. He never expressed any remorse for his actions, despite being found guilty, and maintained his innocence against all conceivable evidence.